Okay, well, welcome. So I'm Steve Lasker. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and we're going to talk about SQL Server Express today. I'm actually going to focus a bit on some of the unique features of SQL Server Express, because there's some things around that that actually can be just a little bit different for the SQL Server product line. Now, Express is actually a pretty interesting product for us. It gives us a chance to use the power of SQL Server in a development environment, because we put it in Visual Studio, and we'll talk about how we can do that in client development as well. We're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about a number of different features. I'm going to do a lot of demos. Again, no World of Warcraft kind of demos, so I kind of trying to figure out exactly how to shoot something up as a varchar column or something, I don't know. One of the main features of SQL Server Express is something we call user instances. And user instances are a way for us to be able to manage database projects as files. So with, a lot of times you're doing development, right? You're working on your laptop, or you're working on your desktop, and you want to be able to move from one place to another. I want to take the project home. And you're working WinForms, WPF, web project, it doesn't really matter. And all of a sudden, you're now wondering, I got to disconnect the database or back it up or restore it and take it with me. So it makes it more difficult sometimes when you want to make those files transparent to be able to work to travel with you. So that's the main feature of what we've done around SQL Server Express and this user instance feature. How many of you have ever heard this term RANU? Okay, so if you don't know about it, don't worry about it. If you've seen it, this is where it came from. When we were developing the feature, the whole goal was we were trying to make it run as a normal user. SQL Server runs as a service, right? It runs as an account, as you've probably seen when you told it the user account and the password expired or something. So we wanted to be able to make that run as you when you're running. That's where we came up with this term, run as normal user was the goal. It technically isn't actually a feature name. It's just if you've ever seen that term. So when we built this feature, we had a couple of goals in mind. And one of which was what I was just talking about as doing development and making it easier. So I could move my files as a whole project. I might check them into source, I want to say Source Depot, Source Safe, Visual Studio Team System, copy them to a network share, zip them up, whatever. So that was one of the big things that we worked on. And we did this for both web and client development. Now, that worked out pretty well. We're pretty happy with it, and that's why I've got this little green traffic light here to kind of symbolize that. The next area we did was around deployment with client apps. And a client app is not necessarily WinForms or WPF. It might be an MSI that you install on a server. I was talking to the gentleman here about using it for log files on all his boxes around the enterprise. And you want to be able to run a setup and get it on there pretty easily. So user instances can be used in that model as well. And it's pretty good for that model. We'll talk about some of the complexities. The last was web deployment. Now this is one that we get a lot of confusion on. User instances, because they run as the user, they run in the process space of the user that spun up the instance. If you're in a web project, that's the ASP account, right? So those processes and that connection starts to have some limitations where it only runs under Windows authentication. You can't connect with a SQL auth, so you can't start doing granular role management. And it uses shared memory, the local connections in name pipes, so you just don't get the kind of granular configuration that you might be used to SQL Server in web environments. So that's why we've kind of taken this and say, great for development, pretty good for client development, as we'll see, not good for web deployment. Now, I'm talking about user instances. Express absolutely can be used for web deployment. And that's where we've got some confusion out there as people hear us talk about Express or user instances not being good for web. So just to balance it, and that pretty much sets up the context for what we're going to talk about today in this talk. So first, let's kind of drill in and just take a look at how user instances can work. I'm going to do a web project here. So what I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I did the 2 execute. Okay, hold on. This is not where the demo is supposed to blow up. Any ideas? Okay, good. All right, we'll pick up where we left off. So I'm going to create a new project. In this case, I'm actually going to do, we'll do a new web project. And I'm just going to pick some arbitrary website, doesn't matter. Now in the project, I'm doing some web development, and I want to just add a database. So I can say add new item, and in here we have the SQL Server database template. And we'll just call it my data. Now it's prompting me, do I want to put it in the data directory? And we'll be fine with that. And then what's happening now is I'm working with it as a file. But what it's going to do is attach that file to SQL Server. And we'll drill into that in a little bit here. But now I can double click that file, and I can work with it right here in Visual Studio, and I can go over here and start and add a new table. We'll just create a quick one here. And we'll set this as the primary key. And we're good. And we'll name it customers. So again, I'll just come over here and I'll show this some table data. And just makes a connection, opens it up, and now I can start entering some data right here. And I have a little thing about the Flintstones, so we'll just put in some Flintstones here. Does Flintstones make it over to Europe? I think Bugs Bunny has made it. I don't know about the Flintstones, so each one's got its own use. All right, so we'll come over here, and nothing special. I'm sure you guys have seen this demo 1,000 times, but I'm just going to use it to set the stage for some other stuff. So we'll do the grid view over here, and now I can choose a data source. Choose database. Leaves a SQL data source. And now in my list of connections, not only do I have the database connections that I have for my server instances, right? I got the whole north one there, but I have mine as well. And if I look at the connection string, there's this data directory macro in there. We'll drill into that in a minute here. But if we look, there's actually attached DB file name is the way I'm passing a path to it. And then I say user instance equals true. Those are unique things around that connection string. We'll save the connection string, and that's important because when we go into production, we're going to want to change that connection string. So it's good to have it in one place. And we'll generate some update statements for it as well. Now we can do the test, right? Make sure everything's good. And we're good to go. All right, so now I've got my web page set up. And I've got the normal stuff on there. We'll do all the little fancy, no, we'll just check everything. Fine. So now I've got my web page, and again, I'm working my project. Well, if I just say view in browser, we'll get what we call Cassini, the development web server, kind of running down here, and now I could view the page. So I very easily can work with that. Now, I have this user instance thing. Well, how did it really connect? Well, if we look, we saw that data directory in there. Let's take a look at how that kind of lines up here. So I'm going to put a label on here. And what I'll do is in the form, I'm just going to say, and so I'm going to code a little bit in VB and C#. I don't really care which one you use. I'm just happy using .NET. So most of the stuff I'm going to show doesn't really matter what language. So we'll do a conversion here in a second. So me.label1.text equals, and then I can just say app domain, current domain, get data. So what we do is we set up a value in the app domain in this property bag that is the data directory. And here's your C# conversion. Okay. So now we'll view in the browser. We'll say save. And now we could see that, here, we'll do the little E7 scroll thing. And now we could see where that file name picked up, okay? So as far as SQL Server is concerned, it's actually still a service running as an attachment. But it has a way to attach to that on the fly using this data directory piece. All right, we'll see if this behaves. Oh, actually, there's one, well, I'll just show it in this slide here. So now I've got my project, right? I just saved in a certain directory. I've run up the page, and it just attaches on the fly. It makes it pretty easy for me to do my development now. So what I've done, though, is I've saved that value in web config. And if we look there, you can see that it's just part of my connection string. So as I go into production, well, let me rephrase that. So what happens is when ASP.NET spins up the first time, that working process is going to set the domain, the app domain property bag, and it'll set it up with the value for its data directory. So that what happens is it'll pick up and it'll expand that at runtime so the server can actually attach to it. And that's just an example. Now, we'll talk about how this is problematic for the production. But the fact that I kept it in my web config allows me to keep this during development. And when I deploy it to production, I could change that to a normal connection string on whatever server it happens to be. So that's how we can balance the two together. Now, how does all this work? Right? Because there's a lot of moving parts to this. Well, what happens is, like I said, is ASP.NET spins up. The first thing is it's going to set that app domain property. Then when the connection object here, again, I actually have some C# here. No comments on the semicolon, just there. And I've highlighted a couple important parts. The attached DB file name, user instance, and open. When open is executed, it goes and looks in the connection object for that data directory and replaces it. So now it'll connect to the main instance of SQL Server. So you install SQL Express on that machine, and it has the standard instance you're probably used to working with. Based on that, user instance equals true, excuse me, it'll now spin up another instance of SQL Server Express. So it'll actually have two instances running. And the way it does that is it copies all of the files, the master, model, tempdb, to a per user directory, and then spins up that instance and allows me to attach to it. So I kind of did this router for the main service, and then I got connected to it. Now, subsequent connections don't have to copy those files. So the first one can sometimes take a little bit longer, depending on what the machine's doing. Running PowerPoint or Outlook or something, it's kind of busy. It takes a little bit of extra work to do that. So that's why we'll say that you may want to increase your connection string timeout to be 60 seconds for the first one. Let's take a look at how this all works. All right, I guess I'm going to do my PowerPoints from this machine also, so we don't have to keep on doing this back and forth. Yeah, I'm just going to stay here then. Does it matter? You're just capturing the output of that, right? Okay. I'm going to stay on my laptop. Okay, so let's see, where I was here, we were going to refresh the web page. So I've got this web page, and what I'm going to do is I've got the directory here. This directory is where SQL Server Express, the user instance, will install it. And if we notice closely, you can see users, my username, and then app data. So it actually has all these files copied into a specific location. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to kill my instance for a second, and I'm actually going to delete all these files. Think of it as a way to reset SQL Server. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to just clean SQL Server up all the time that way when you've got some goofy config in there? So there's some cool advantages to this. And then what I'm going to do is we'll leave this running here. Now, if we notice in Task Manager, you can see SQL Server exe. That's the main instance. It's the instance you're probably used to working with. And it's running as a network service. It's not currently on network enabled, but it runs as a network service from a permissions level. So now what I'm going to do is if I just refresh this page, we'll see as it does that routing, it goes to the main instance, says, hey, I need a user instance. Here's the file path I want to connect to. Oh, I'm not configured for user instances now. Go create the user instance databases for me in files, including the log files. And if we notice over here, I have another instance of SQL Server exe running. And you can see, it's kind of spun and it's running under me. So I can now have that instance running. So I can configure that guy completely independent of the other instance that's on my machine. Oh yeah, I'm going to stay here. Okay. So just to kind of recap of that, what it does is when it first spins up under user instances, it'll copy those databases. It'll start under the user process. In this case, it was me. You saw that on Task Manager. And it'll route it around. Now, if it's inactive for 60 minutes, it'll actually completely kill that process. Okay? But it'll actually page down in memory pretty well. Now, you can configure that with this spconfigure command on how much it takes to time out. And the subsequent usages of that user instance, the files are already there. So you're only going to take that performance hit the first time. And here, just to recap, I can see the two instances running. And over time, the main instance, the one that was running as the router, will actually page out of memory and it will kind of reduce down. If you're only using the main instance, that's the one that'll grow, 100, 200, 300 meg, depending on what you're kind of doing with it, in the 7 meg or so when you're, just kind of working within basic scenarios. All right, so that's great. I've got this user instance. I can do a bunch of stuff right in Visual Studio, right? We did some table editing and so forth. But there's a lot of features in Management Studio, generating scripts, working with user permissions, configuring the database, a lot of features in there that I want to be able to work with. But I got this user instance that I'm attaching to as a file. How can I attach to that? Let's take a look. So I'm going to switch over here to Management Studio. Now in Management Studio, I can't actually connect with a file path, right? That functionality isn't really there. But I can, but I've already got a connection to it, right? I've got my Visual Studio thing going over here. And I've got the database already set up. Well, I want to be able to connect to that guy. So the way you can do that is we have these dynamic management views, these DMs. That's what the DM things start with. And if I just query from that guy, I can actually get, oh, I don't want to have the selection, sorry. I can get the name pipe for that particular instance. So now I can copy that value, and I can see here that the heartbeat is it's alive. I guess this kind of didn't get past our poly check, alive and dead, but I don't know. I guess it's a good term. And now I could connect and paste that in, and now I'm talking directly to that database. So I can get all the powerful features that I'm used to right here. And just spin it up. Thinking about it. So I can go and manage my users and permissions and so forth. And now you could see this somewhat long path to my database. And that's how SQL Server is handling the files. So I can come back and you can see my table there and so forth. Okay? So that's going to be kind of handy to work with over time. So user instances, they must be running for you to be able to connect with that pipe when you want to query with that query I've got set up and open it up. If it's dead, it's not going to wake, it's not going to become alive. There's no reanimator thing going on here. So you either attach to it with your app. So if your app is running and you want to debug the app, you can just run that query as well. So that's another way that can be pretty helpful. Now, the developer that worked with on my team when we worked on this in Visual Studio 2005, Antoine, we didn't have all our tooling stuff working at the time. So he wrote this little applet that he calls SSE util, which is a little command line that lets you do a lot of functionality and test it at a command line when you want to poke at the user instance. And it's actually available on MSDN, and you can download that, and it can be really helpful in debugging and troubleshooting. And then we just did the connection string here, querying off of it, and you can connect in. All right, so that was the basic Management Studio stuff. Let's take a look at how we can work with this in Visual Studio. So how many of you guys are developers? Okay. How many are DBAs? Couple. Okay. You're outnumbered, so sorry. The developers are always going to make the DBAs kind of nervous. So let's take a look at how we could use it on the client. Now, I'm going to spend a bit of time here talking about the client stuff, but we'll bridge this over to the server as well, because a lot of stuff is shared. But one of the questions we get a lot is, where exactly does SQL Express fit in this spectrum, especially now that we have SQL Server Compact available? So I just want to use this to be the staging for this to understand the two. This is my only marketing-ish kind of slide, but it helps to get the point across. So with SQL Server Express, we see it as the power of SQL Server in a smaller footprint. Right? SQL Server is quite, it's running massive things. We can actually run the biggest data centers on SQL Server. And we can run SQL Express there as well. And it's part of our client. If we notice, the blue kind of overlaps a bit there for our clients. So when you want the power of SQL Server and the consistency of the server programming model, we have that with SQL Express, SQL Server Express. Now, in our client spectrum, we have quite a range of clients. I was searching around, and I actually found this little goofy Hello Kitty thing over here. I think Hello Kitty's over here too, unfortunately. And it actually runs Windows embedded. I guess that's how they figure out what it's supposed to talk when you talk to it, or how it dances or poos or whatever the thing does. I don't know. So we have the power of running a SQL Server products from the smallest embedded device all the way up to the largest data center. And what we've done is to address the consistency of our clients, because people want to develop consistently across all of these clients. And there's a lot more businessy kind of apps in there, between the gas pump or the point of sale systems or the tablets or the hardened laptops or desktops for that matter, is we have a consistent programming model across all of that with SQL Server Compact. And with there, we focus on deployment, ease of deployment as the priority. On the right, priority is server programming model. Deployment is less of a concern. On the left, consistency across all our clients, with deployment being the top concern. So I'll talk more about that on Wednesday on SQL Server Compact. And then we have synchronization capabilities to keep our clients and our servers in sync. I have a talk tomorrow on that, and we have several talks related to the sync framework that's coming out as well. So on the client apps with user instances, they're very much similar. We've got the add new item template, we've got data source configuration tools, all that same kind of thing. And you can copy the database with your project. Copy the files from one place to another, and you're good to go for development. Very, very productive, very helpful. But when I want to deploy this, well, how do I actually get the database out there as well? So let's go, and we'll create another project here. This time I'm going to do a Windows Forms project. And I'll do very much the same, actually, sorry, not that one. I want actually, this project here. So what I've got here is I got a WinForms project, and I just got it set up to save some typing here for these two buttons. And I'm going to say I want to add a new item. And now we'll see that we have SQL Express here. And with SQL Server Compact, we were trying to help understand the two. So we actually have service-based database being the best we could come up with on how to describe this, compared to local database. And what we've done is we've tried to make them more scenario-oriented, because we keep on changing the names. So we had MSDE, which became SQL Express. It's the next version. SQL Server CE became SQL Mobile, became SQL Server Compact, same engine. So we have a bad habit of changing names. In databases, we talk about primary keys should never change. We don't follow our own best practices here. So anyway, I can add the local database, and just like the web project, I can do the same exact experiences. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm actually going to add an existing item. And I'll come over here and I'll say all files because I want to get the MDF. And I could say grab the Northwind MDF in this case. Now another nice feature is I can just grab the MDF file. We'll create the log on the fly for you. So that was another feature that we added as part of the Express code base to make it easier. Because if you ever keep those things out of sync, if you get a log file from another database that's named the same, we get very confused. And we'll take the safe model and say, we're not going to do anything. Because this looks like something bad happened, and we want to make sure your data is safe. So best practice, assuming you've truncated your logs and all of that, is just get rid of the log and just copy the MDF around the project. All right, so we've got that. And now I can simply drag and drop this customers grid on here. And we'll just dock in the parent container, and life's good. So now I've added this MDF to my project, and for all intents and purposes, this might as well have been a new project. As soon as we do that, what we do is in Click Once. So how many of you guys are familiar with Click Once? Okay. The Click Once is one of our ways to make deployment of client apps much easier. You can basically just publish it to a file share, a web server, and you can send the URL to your customers, your employees, and they just click on the link just like they would a web page. And then we can bring that in to that user's machine. Now, what we've done is SQL Server Express is the server, right? It does need admin rights to be installed. It has an MSI and needs some setup. But we can help ease that setup. Right here, we've got a prereq, which is a way to ease deployment of components within Visual Studio. And once I added that MDF file to my project, we automatically check this for you. So that now when I go and do a Click Once publish of this app, and we've got that all set up there, is we'll go back and it'll clear it, publish it out to the website. And what I'll notice here is in addition to my app, it has the ability to check the prerequisites. So if I click this button, we dynamically build a setup file for you that you can run to actually check. And it's just going to run it. And it turns out I do have SQL Express on my machine. So it just went on, and now I can run my app under Click Once. Spinning up that user instance, connecting to it, and now I'm good. And if we look, here I've got these buttons. Here's my application that I put. So it's got all the files for it. Change the view here. And if we notice, it's got this really long GUID directory. And that's just the way that Click Once allows me to manage deployed files on the machine. How many of you guys know what the file name is when you browse a web page? Like, who cares? It's the same model we're trying to do here with Click Once. You manage it through shortcuts, launch the app, and it's managed and requisitioned by the provisioned by the operating system. And then the data directory is the mapped data folder for that particular application. It's not in the same directory as the app. They're managed as pairs. And that's another reason why the data directory macro is so important, because we can't just look at the same path of the exe, or whatever your hosting is. You have to actually know what the data directory is for that particular app. So when Click Once launches, just like ASP.NET, it sets that app domain property, and that's how it can figure out where it's supposed to manage the data files from. Okay. So that's how we can get the engine on the machine. There's this MSI that we ship as part of Visual Studio that will hook into the prereq of Click Once. Now, when you're using Click Once with Visual Studio 2005, we have the RTM version of SQL Server. That's what's baked into the product. Because we're shipping Visual Studio 2008, before we finished SQL Server 2008, it'll still be SQL Server 2005. But we've bumped it up to SP2, so we're trying to give you the latest and greatest there. Now, you can deploy from different locations. When the user's trying to install that machine, you can actually specify where you want it to publish from. So on the prereqs, there's actually these radio buttons here, deploy from the component vendor site, us, download from the same directory as my application, so I can put all the files up on the web server, on the file share, or on a CD, and I can know to load it from that location, or a completely different site. I might have all of my setups on another location and my apps over here. So you kind of split those things up through click once. Now you can do this for MSIs. We know that people are still shipping apps with MSIs. They want to ship it, whether it be on a CD or download from the web. They're not using click once. They want to install in the normal program files directories. And you can certainly do that as well. And there's some good articles. In fact, the hidden slides at the end of my deck have some information and links to that as well. Now, when we start talking about deploying the data files, though, things get really complex. And here the problem is that we need to work in the build system of client apps. In web apps, we're running from this kind of directory thing that files just kind of exist in. We're not really building an app. Client apps, we actually have builds and we have output files. And depending on where those go, they can actually build more and more. So again, the data files, it actually can be great for development. So you're sitting in there and you hit F5, you're testing your app, and you're typing in goofy things. Right? Might be my Flintstones thing. You probably don't want to deploy the Flintstones out to your production app. So you can save inside of Visual Studio the clean version of your database. And then when you're testing it, whatever gets put in the debug directory, just toss it each time. And that's kind of the default experience that Visual Studio has. And if you know that, pretty good. If you don't know it, it looks like your data is going away. So we'll drill into that in a minute. Now, here's an example. You build, and the Northwind MDF file there at the bottom gets copied to the debug directory. I do a release build. It gets copied to the release directory. I do a click once publish. It's going to copy it again over here. So these files can start to get very complicated in where they go. So it gets even worse in deployment. I install this app on my machine. I got version 1. I now want to get version 2. Well, data files usually allow the users to enter data in there. I don't want to lose that data. So we have to start managing it a little bit differently than just a file management. So let's take a look at how this kind of plays out. All right. So I'm going to take this app, and we're going to run it right here. And by default, Visual Studio has set it up so that file is copied to output directory always. We'll stop and dig into that in a second. So I'm going to change the region here and save it as debug. And I'll save it. But now if I take a look and make sure that my save button worked, I'll come over here to the Northwind file. I'll go to customers, close out in customers, and I'm not going to see anything. Well, did my save button work? Well, it did. So I'm going to make this the project one. I'll save that there. What happened is, as I showed you, Visual Studio made a copy of that, put it in the debug directory. So now if I double click this copy of Northwind MDF, I'll get another one down here, Northwind 1. And if I look at customers here, we'll see my, scroll over, debug, okay? So it's managing them separately. So if you know it, great. If you don't, how do you know your data actually was saved? All right, so now it gets a little bit different in deployment as well. So let's take a look at how this is going to work. I'm going to publish this out again. And remember, I made it proj was the name of the data that I put in the on the customers table before I published it. And that's the one that was in my project, right? So we'll deploy this. And what it did was it's got that file set up as copy always, so I've got my proj one there. Now, let's go back and change this. We're going to make this the click once version here. We'll save it. And now I'm going to come over here and we'll make a couple of changes. One, I'm going to just resize my form a little bit to get my code to be slightly updated. I'll come over here and get the right database, and I'll go to my employees, and I'm just going to make a subtle change to the data. So we'll make Nancy with an I. So I've made some changes. Maybe somebody else in my project team made some changes. Didn't even notice that, right? So now when I go to publish this guy again, I'll publish the update, version X, whatever it is, and then I'll push it out to the website again. But instead of launching it, I'm actually not going to launch it directly from the web page. I'm going to launch it from over here, Microsoft, so I get the nice shortcut set up here. And I got an update. Do I want it? Well, of course I want the update, right? Updates are always great. Never have bugs in updates. Well, let's go see what's going to happen here. Again, spins up the user instance, connects, and my data's gone. So where'd it go? Well, I mentioned before that Click Once manages data files. So what we did is we actually copied the old version to this .pre folder. In fact, if I copy these files back up and paste them there, making sure I copy both of them, not just the MDF, and I launch this again, I'll get my data back. So there's my click. I guess I didn't click once, I just clicked. So now I've got my data. Now, the thing to be careful about this is that .pre folder is only one version past. So when you realize you made a mistake and you go publish another version of the app to try to fix it and copy the file back, it's going to copy yet another file in there and push that one into the trash in your host. So you got to be really careful with this. All right, so don't want to do that. Well, what do you do about it? I'm not just going to leave you with a problem. So how do we manage that? Right, here, I'm going to set you up. It's awful. Now everybody go to another session. So let's talk about how we can fix that. And we'll see that this is going to apply to web projects as well. So I want to be able to deploy my updates via Click Once, via an MSI, via web, whatever it is. I have a database. I have some schema. I have my data, and I have the user's data that I want to maintain. So what do we do? Well, what you can do is actually put scripts into your app to manage that deployment, right? Because you want to merge in the changes of both. So this is why we call it the best practice. We have the data file stuff in here, and if it's read-only data because it's the product catalog or a list of codes or something, and the user is never making changes to it, then fine, publish it out, right? But if your users are making data, you want to manage those a little bit better. So you get a lot more control over it. You can manage the upgrades. You can go from version 1 directly to version 3. And it gives you a lot more control about how you want to do those changes. And we'll show an example of how publishing an entire table or an update to an entire table may not be the most efficient thing. You might have only updated the value in an individual column. So how can we do that? Now, the negative side of it is this is not an out-of-the-box experience. It does require a little bit of work, which means you guys still have a job. We're trying to make sure. Part of our job is to make sure you guys still have a job. If we made everything too easy, then we could all go on vacation, I guess. But unfortunately, they don't seem to pay us for that. So let's take a look at how we can do this. We'll close this one. I got another project which is similar to this one. We'll do a little bit different. All right. So what I've got here is I got another project set up. Now, what I've done is I've taken the file, the MDF file, and I've told it in the build action, from a build action, it's none. It's not content. It's not an embedded resource. Just leave it alone. Ignore it. Because if I set it to content, the click once publishing will try to deploy the file. Now, I don't want it in my output directory either, so I said do not copy. Well, if I don't have a database there, how am I going to work? So what I've done is I've created some T-SQL scripts, and I've got one here, create database, AdventureWorks, department, because I've got just a sub piece of it, and I tell it to create it in a particular location, and I'm giving it the data directory macro. Now, this is definitely an extension of what you can run in Management Studio. You cannot run a data directory macro in Management Studio. It will choke. I'll show how I'm going to use this in a second. Now what I'll do is I have another script for creating the schema. I will notice all the ugly quoted things on there. So you can see I pretty much ran this right out of Management Studio to generate the scripts. But I also have another table that I put here. And this is how I'm going to put a versioning in my database and keep it in sync with my app. So I want to be able to query the database and say, what version are you? So I have this property bag kind of thing I've set up in my database, and I just call it app info. And then when I load my initial data, one of the things I'll do is I'll insert into the app info version, and I'll stick 1.0 in there for now. To synchronize that with my app, not synchronize, overloaded word, sorry, is I've got a settings property called DB version 1.0 in here, and that's what I'm going to compare in code. Now, these resources, the way I got them in here was I first went, I said add new item, and there's a resource file. And once that's done, I named it database scripts, or database scripts. And then I can just say add existing file. So I can just create these .sql files in Management Studio, save them, import them in, and now I can just copy and paste them back and forth. Because we notice it's got all the Go stuff in here, so I can just test these as is. But I want them as embedded resources, because I definitely don't want these files sitting on the end user's machine for them to go muck with and making changes to the database as it's installed on their environment. So I've got the scripts, I got the embedded resources in there. It's all good. So let's take a look at how this is all going to work when it runs. So let me just make sure I clean this up. Yep, we're good. So I'll hit F5. And the first thing I'm going to do is I've got this method called setDataPath. Now, I talked about how the data directory works in ASP.NET and Click Once. When those two processes spin up, they set the property bag in the app domain. So the SQL connection object can go off and read that in. But when I'm running under F5, there's no real process that we were able to stick that value in. So it gets a little confused, because we've got the data files and the executable in the same directory. So I needed to set this value in here for it to map it out. So what I'm going to do here is, in here, I've even taken it further, and I could have a custom location in my app. I could say, hey, I don't know what data directory is doing, stick it over here. So I've got a setting property that if it's not blank, it'll use that one. It is blank, so we'll skip on. Now, I want to know if I'm running under Click Once. The way I can tell that is under the application deployment class, we've got a property called isNetworkDeployed. And that just means that it was published and running via Click Once, and if it's true, the data directory is going to be set for me. It's not, because I'm running under F5. So what I'm going to do is simply get the location of the assembly and stuff it into the app domain. That's all that ASP.NET and Click Once do. They figure out where the data directory is, they set that value, and off it goes. So this little property bag in the app domain can be pretty helpful for you in lots of different places. All right, so we'll step out of that. Now the next thing I want to do is verify my database is actually set up. So I'm looking here, and I'm actually in the app startup. So in a C# project, we have the startup program CS. VB, we have the application events that we can extend off of. So in verified database, I passed in a connection string. Now, if we look at this connection string, we see it's got the attached DB file name, data directory, and our MDF. User instance equals true. And notice I bumped my timeout to 60 seconds to make sure Express has the time to spin up the first time. So we'll step into that. Now, this is where I need to be able to check if the file exists, because as far as this app's concerned, I'm treating Express as a data file. So all I need to know is, does that file exist? If it does, my database exists. But what I have to do is I have to get the file name out of the connection string. Because if you remember, the connection string has it as name value pairs in there. Now, we're pretty smart developers. We can go do some string parsing and pull it out. But there's actually some properties here that make it easier for us. I can use the connection string builder. And the connection string builder has an attached DB file name property on it. And I can go pull out the data directory path for that. Or actually, I pull out the path with data directory. And if it contains it, I need to fix it up. Connection string builder doesn't know how to parse the data directory. It just gives you the property out. So I'm going to do a string search and replace of data directory with the app domain get data directory, right? The value either I set in my code or click once or ASP.NET had set for me. So now it's doing a check. If we hover over here, we can see it expanded it all out. So I get the fully qualified path. And it doesn't exist. Whoops. What did I press? Oh, there we go. The file didn't exist, so now it knows to go create the database. So I pass in the connection string again. All right? Fully qualified connection string with the whole thing in there. But now I've got to do this create database. This is where it gets a little funky. This is kind of what's talking about the user instance feature and how maybe how successful we were at implementing it in 2005. In order to create a database, I have to actually attach to the user instance. Well, my connection string has the database name I need to attach to, but it doesn't exist yet. So how can I attach to a database that doesn't exist to create the database that doesn't exist? Gets a little confusing. So what I want to do is attach to the master database, the default. So the way I can do that is if I just blank out attach DB file name, it'll figure it out and go straight to the master. It'll revert up to the default, which in user instances is master. So it blanks it out, and then I could run the script. Now, if you remember, this is what I said about the script is actually running a macro in it with the data directory in it. SQL Server certainly doesn't know what data directory is. It's part of our ADO.NET stack. So I need to take my create database script, which has a file name data directory, and replace that with the actual path. So SQL Server can actually connect to it. So we'll do that. We'll step into that. And now, if I look at my connection string, we'll see, I'm sorry, not the connection string. Oh, well, here, the connection string, notice it says attach file name equals blank. So that's how I'm talking to master. And it's going to step through, open a connection to that guy, and it'll run that script, which now, if I look at the fully qualified, or the expanded script, we see it says, hey, attach that directly in this location, or create it in this location. Execute non-query, we'll do the thing. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to detach it. Now, the reason, so I got to use master, so I'll switch back out of that database. And I need to detach. Again, so with user instances, I've now attached the database to the user instance, not the main instance, the user instance. And it's not the file name, path, it's yet something else. So I had to do this kind of weird man-in-the-middle kind of, well, it made it sound like attack. It wasn't supposed to be that. This weird kind of off thing just to create the database so that later on I can attach it as a file. So we'll do the detach, and then we're good. And we'll step out of that. So now I've got my database. I've detached it, but I've got my file in place now. Now, when I want to run the script again this time, notice the connection string actually has data directory back in it again. So now when I step over and open that up, notice the open worked really fast because I already had the files for the user instance in place, and I just attached to that database with the Northwind or whatever it is, I forget it is, and just attached it because the database was already created as well. So it went through pretty quick. And now I'm just going to execute those commands in a loop, right? Create the table, insert all the values, and we'll just step out of that. And then we'll run that, and then lastly, we'll run the script for load initial data, and just the quick one, insert into values, so on and so forth. All right, a big step through of the create database. Now, I got my baseline database. Which version is it? Now, you could be smart about this and know if I created it, I know the version, but we'll step through this for the sake of it. I'm now going to query that value from the app info table and grab that. And then I'm going to compare it against that settings class that I had in my code. So I want to keep my code and my database and compare the two. In this case, they're equal, so I'm good. I'll step out. Databases are equal, return true, nothing special to do, and they'll just load the data, and I'm fine. Okay, get the basic idea there? And I can go through, and now I can actually add a new value, and what I'll do is I'll call this the debug version. And when I save this here, we can see that my app directory, which because I'm in the debug mode, isn't the same. My database is the same as my executable. All right, data directory, same place. All right. So now, and I want to click once publish this guy. So I'll publish this. I think I cleaned it up. And we'll install it. Let me just check something real quick. Good. So now, if we notice, I've only got 16 rows. That bogus data that I typed in when I was doing my debug stuff is gone. I only have the stuff that was in my scripts. So I've got a nice, clean project and data that was sent out. In fact, I'll save it here and add another row. Save. And my app directory, right? And my data directory. There's my database that I created on the fly. That's not the file from my project. That's based on the scripts that we've created. All right. Now, who gets their app done right the first time? All right, we're always making changes. Intentional or unintentional, we're making changes. So we now want to make an addition to this. So I'll come over here, and we want to add another flag to our table. So I'll come over to my database, and now I'm lazy or I'm productive. I'm not sure which to call it. I don't really care. It works for me. I'm going to use the designers. So I'm going to open the table definition, and I want to go add another column. We'll call it the active column. We'll make it a bit. Now, I'm working in the designer, but I have to save the scripts. How do I get the script out of it? Now, we've got great products with Visual Studio data. All I can call it is Data Dude. Visual Studio Team System for Databases, I think we called it. We've got that, which will help you generate diffs. But here's a trick you can use right here with SQL Server Profiler. So with SQL Profiler, I can actually monitor the scripts that are executing, or commands that are executing into the database. But I need to connect to that user instance. So I'll come over here. I'll use my little trick. I'll get the pipe. And then over here, with SQL Profiler, I could connect to that instance. And now I can actually watch the commands that Visual Studio is going to generate when I save this guy. So now I was able to go grab the alter table statement right here, and I can just put this right in my app. All right. All right. So now I've got that. So I can paste it in there, and I've got my alter statement. So I got my scripts all tested, and I'm going to actually update all the rows for that column that I just added. I want to make sure that all the ones that were already there, the default is 1. But I want to intermix it with the data the user's already typed in, right? Because I'm going to typed in that extra 17th row. How do I save that? So I'm going to alter the table, and I'm just going to update this new column and set the active flag to 1. And then I'll make sure my database is updated as version 1001, and I can now check that here. So I'll go to my settings class, just bump that up as 1. We'll save that. And now, of course, we want to test this here before I click once publish it. So we'll hit F5 here. Oh, sorry, I got to do one more thing. So if I put new data in the database, is it at all useful unless I actually show it? This is kind of the one thing I always, can you deploy updates automatically? Well, yeah, we can, but what good is it if the database can't actually, the app doesn't actually use that column? So I'll come over to the data sources window, and I'll use this little configure button. And if we notice, the checkbox is not, it's the try state. It shows that, hey, something is not complete. So it's saying, hey, you got the active flag. And this will actually show you if it thinks there's a column that's no longer in the database, because you renamed it or dropped it, we'll show a little red bang next to it as well, so you know to drill in and figure out what's going on there. So I'll come over here, and I'm just going to drag and drop and get this extra column now added to my form. These little snap lines, get it in place. So now my app actually has this update as well. Let's go hit F5. And we'll set the data path. Nothing interesting there. We've been through that. And we'll step through that. Verify database. If the file exists. Well, yeah, because we've already created it, and we didn't go off and delete it. Now I'm going to do the check version. We'll get the version out. Notice the version is 10, because I didn't publish the file. That's wrong. So I need to be able to step back and say, it's the older version, not a newer version. Right? We didn't get some time warp here. And now I want to run that script. And in this case, I've got a script I've specifically said, from 10 to 11. You can go to 10 to 20. You can go from 1 to 3. So you don't have to force your users who may have been off for a couple of months to iterate through all the versions. Completely up to you on how you want to run that through. And we'll just run the app now. So notice I've got my 17 rows. My data is all set up. And of course, my last one, which was the debug version, has been set as well. So I merged in my user data as well. And then, of course, if I just click once publish this, because now it worked fine in development. It's going to work fine in production too, right? We never get differences there. So we'll, let's see, express script deployment. Got an update? Yep. And now I've got my extra checkbox. And now the 17th value is the click once version. Okay? And if we notice, if we go to the data directory, there's no more .pre folder. So there is no files to copy back over and worry about losing the user data. I'm completely managing it on myself. Now, the interesting thing to be weary of, or be aware of, rather, weary or aware, depends on the day, is click once. The way it gets those updates, it is going to make another folder, for all the files that it's downloading for updates. And only once it's successful will it redirect your shortcuts to point to the new directory. This is why you really want to use the data directory macro for this and not try to manage it yourself, because you'll get hosed. It's trying to be way too smart. You could argue it's way too complicated and over-engineered, but hey, we're Microsoft, we got lots of smart people, we have to make use of them somewhere. All right, so that's that one. All right, we got our scripts. So again, the way you do this is don't copy the files. This is going to apply for websites as well. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing a client app, a web app, a service you're rolling out to a bunch of machines. Set the build action none. So in this case for click once, so it doesn't try to publish it. And then copy never for the copied output directory. And then just add some code here on your app startup to verify that the database exists and it's the appropriate version. And then run the scripts. And you can use embedded resources to manage them. You're going to have to come up and sing now. All right, so I talked a bit about some of these user instances. Well, where are they going? Well, we saw it's pretty good for development, right? We really did a good job. You can copy your files around. Things are going to be traveling with it. Pretty good for productivity. So we're absolutely going to maintain that experience. Production deployment, not so good. When you're running under ASP.NET, all of the sites will be running under the ASP user account. Not so good when you're trying to isolate those. So we have some problems there. We have some issues with how the files are being copied and the time it takes to spin up the multiple instances we're running. So we are going to be getting rid of user instances as we know them today in a future release. We did not pull them out of SQL Server 2008. We know that many people are just starting to use them or have already used them. We have the experience in Visual Studio that we didn't want to break, so those are there. So what the recommendation here is simply, when you need them, use them. First of all, use it for development. Very easy to move this around in development. In production, use it in isolation. If we look at the code that I did, it's pretty much the connection string and one class on how I manage the creation of the database. Once I get out of that code, it's just a connection string. We're absolutely going to have whatever our future implementation of this be based on a connection string. So as long as you don't have multiple connection strings scattered into thousands of places in your apps, you'll be fine. So that's just kind of giving an idea of what we're doing with this. I tell you what it is, but I don't know what it is yet. We knew we couldn't get it done for SQL Server 2008, so we just said, we'll worry about it later. All right, how do we work with web projects? Now, the way I kind of did the click once deployment with scripts was great for client apps where I can roll it out in that way. But with websites, especially if you're hosting to a hosting website, I need to be able to get up there because they typically don't let you run Management Studio across the internet to their database. You have some kind of web portal that you can go through and execute scripts and so forth. Well, we've created this hosting toolkit that we made available last year, and we've now integrated into both Management Studio and Visual Studio. So there's a publishing service that you or your hosting site can actually set up. And then there's a publishing wizard that we've made available as well. Let's take a look at that. So again, I'm just going to double click my MDF, right? The same MDF that I'm using the user instances and copying it around with my project. And I could come over here and I could say publish to provider. So I get the publishing wizard, and then I can select the database. And of course, I'm going to get the long thing, which apparently, does it? Okay, we do. Good. Didn't know if we had that scrolling over there. We have a habit of letting things be too long and fall off the edge at times. So I could see that's the particular database, or the other ones that are available. I can take all the objects when I'm just trying to do the initial posting, or I can drill into some individuals. So I'll say just the tables. I'll get just department. We'll leave app info alone. And now I can publish it to a file and save it as a set of scripts, or I can publish it directly to the hosting site if they have the toolkit set up. So I can go over here and set this up for the name, the website service address, and permissions, and I can use existing databases. So we'll get this nice service interaction talking back and forth between that hosting service. I tend to focus on occasionally connected apps, so I never do demos where I assume I have a connection. So I'm going to just save this to this script. We'll generate amount. We get some more options here. I can say drop the existing objects. I can specify schemas, because you might be publishing to a different schema. You can script out which version of the database you're going to, 2000 and 2005, because we didn't ship 2008 just yet. And do I want schema, the data, right, or both? And we'll just go through next and say finish. So now it'll just go through my database, script those out, save them to a file, and once that's finished, we can come over here to Management Studio and we can open up that file. And there's a script that's generated. All right, so got all my stuff. I can publish it directly to the hosting site, or I can use these scripts to kind of work as how I want to send updates to that server as well. And oh, it's in Management Studio as well. So I have Management Studio 2008 here, and I can go over here and let's see the database, and let me see something. I don't remember where we put that, so I'll skip that. Management Studio isn't as done as Visual Studio. We got a couple more months left, but it'll be, the publishing wizard will be available there as well. So, great. So what's coming in 2008? I saw a bunch of you guys were already using 2005. That's great. What are we doing Express going forward? We've done a number of different things. So one of which was we had a lot of people that were asking for native support for 64-bit. Even though SQL Express runs out of process from your hosting app, so if your app is running 64-bit native and Express 2005, even though it's running in WoW mode, you can still connect to it. But some people wanted to use Express in native 64, so we've actually done that. We'll make that available in 2008 as well. We've done the data types, the new data types that we've added. We've made those available in Express. So file stream, when you're working with things that are larger than 2 GB and you don't want them in the physical database, you want them out of place, or you want to work with them as a file stream object. We've added some new data types, date and time. We've separated them out now, so you can actually stop having to do all this parsing and trying to figure out which one is which. We've expanded the range for datetime, so unfortunately we've had to call it datetime 2. And we've gotten a little bit better around working around geographic time zones, so we now have the datetime offset. So it'll help you know that this was created in Eastern time or Calcutta time or whatever, so you can tell what the offset of what that was. We've added the spatial data types, so you can work with things as shapes. And we've added this feature called hierarchy ID, which is one of these models of pay me now, pay me later kind of thing. If you ever have like an employee that reports to somebody else, and you've got to traverse that to figure out the fully qualified path of that, at runtime, that can be pretty painful. When you insert the data, it's pretty straightforward. You set the parent ID. So it's still a pay me now, pay me later, but the majorities are reads, not writes. So what we've done is with hierarchy ID, we've allowed you to shift that expensive and more tedious coding thing to the upfront. So I'm sure there's sessions here this week that will drill into those. Another feature was the full text search. So in 2005, when you did a query, a full text search query, it was actually managed separately. So there was some performance, opportunities for us to do in 2008. So now we've pulled that directly into the engine, and you can now do joins between a full text search query and an int, or all these other data types, and it'll be much more optimized. Now the last one here we have is something called change tracking. And Philip will be talking about that later in the week. I think it's on Friday. And what we've done is we've taken, we were talking earlier about merge replication, and merge replication is managed with a set of triggers and a set of columns. And even if you promise not to change the primary key, we don't believe you. So we add a row GUID column to every one of your tables. So because of that extra user data, user column data, because the triggers, performance under merge replication can actually be slower than it could be if we did something different. So we've added a new feature called change tracking, which runs at the engine level. So as changes are being made to your tables, instead of having triggers maintain other tables for deletes or updates, we can do it much lower level in the engine. So it runs much, much faster. And we're going to leverage that with sync services that I'll be demoing Wednesday. And Philip and Neil will be talking about later this week as well. For development, we've added some stuff. So with sync services for radio.net, we have a SQL Server Compact provider built into Visual Studio. With SQL Server 2008, we'll make Express a provider as well, so that when you have environments, whether it's be Express deployed in the client or Express is in a server and you want to synchronize over a more developer-oriented sync technology, you'll be able to leverage that as well. Of course, Link and the ADO.NET Entity Framework are available. There's nothing really specific about Express there. It's across all of our SQL Server product line from Compact to Enterprise. Now, the management tools, the Express management tools, we've added some new work as well. We've added the import and export wizard so you can actually get your data in and out of it more easily. We've added the data management framework so you kind of get an SMS-ish kind of way to control things that says stored procedures should always be named this, or whatever the big brother things that the couple DBAs here that want to control all your developers from putting random things in the database. You've got improved script generation, so those will be done in the Management Studio as well. And lastly, we've done a bunch of stuff in reporting services, the version that ships with Express, to be able to work with more control sets. So you can leverage those in your reports. You can actually export to Word. So now when it drops a file on the machine, it could be automatically be in Word format and bring those into your apps, or just open it up directly in Word. And for those scenarios where people are just generating reports and dropping files on a share, they're kind of frustrated they had to have IIS configured as well in the box. So we've removed that restriction. Now, if you want to surf to those reports over web servers, of course we need that, but we don't need IIS just to generate the reports. So those are some of the changes we made. So covered quite a bit. We talked about user instances, how they work, how you can connect to them, give you a bit of roadmap so you can kind of understand where you should use them, how you should use them. We talked about how to connect in Management Studio so you can still get the power of all of that. Covered a lot of the client and web stuff with Visual Studio 2005 and 2008. While I demoed 2008, the basic model, everything I showed you, is still completely available in 2005. Nothing I really showed you other than the web deployments. Actually, the web deployment stuff is available for 2005 as well. So we have a better integrated story than 2008, and it's just we continue to integrate those. We talked about how we can deploy both in client apps using click once and scripts, manage the scripts, don't deploy files. And lastly, we talked about some of the features. So just kind of a wrap up, again, consistent across all of them, clients and servers. I'll talk about Compact. I think it's on Wednesday. In fact, we'll find out in a minute here. Lots of resources that are available. The PowerPoint and demos I'll make available on my blog for the script generation and other stuff that I showed. And there's lots of stuff around 2005 and 2008 available. The publishing wizard is there. And those are some other sessions that we're covering this week. Some kind of related to local storage and sync. So we'll be talking about the sync framework tomorrow. And think of that as version 2 of what we're shipping in Visual Studio 2008. And we'll talk a lot about how we can extend that further. And unfortunately, our scheduling didn't work out that well. Neil is going to be talking about how you can write custom providers for the sync framework if you want to sync shoes or contacts or something that you need to write your own. I'll be talking about how we can use what's shipping in Visual Studio 2008 to synchronize data using sync services, which is the first release of the sync framework. And then we'll drill more in, and there on Wednesdays, the Compact talk to see the counterpart to how you can use this. And Philip will drill in, I'm dragging in something, too much drag and drop here, and stuff with sync. We'll be at the booth, so we'll be around, and I'll take some Q&A. So thank you very much for coming. I hope that was helpful. Thanks. I do need to remind you to fill out your evals, please, so you can register to win. The feedback is always helpful when you guys give us comments. Hopefully, I tried to talk slower, or at least put pauses in. I apologize if it was too fast. Let me know. And I'll take any questions from anybody that has any questions. Anybody? Yeah.
In there, you just check the box for the SQL Server Express. What if you don't want the default installation, if you want to change some of the settings?
So the question, I'll just repeat it for the recording there. If you want to customize what the defaults are, so you can actually author your own prereq. So there's a bunch of stuff. We created one, which you can go rip apart and make changes to it, make changes to like the options for how it gets installed, the database options, install it in different directories and all of that kind of stuff. So you have the prereqs are just our way. In fact, you can extend the list of prereqs. So not only can you custom author one, you can actually get it right into Visual Studio so somebody else can checkbox it for you.
Where can we find out more information?
Well, actually, there's a link right on the dialog, if you remember, that says how do you get more. So there's some stuff there. In the hidden slides at the end of my deck, I've got some links to that as well. And on the blogs for the Express blog, Mike's got some stuff on there. So, anybody else? Yes? Yes. Okay, so the question was, what kind of limitations do we have on the database in 2005 and 2008? So we still have the 4 gig limitation from 2005 to 2008. That's still the same. It's the same kind of single processor kind of limitations. So basically the model is at the lower end, we figure at the free SKU that we give away, there's got to be some kind of reason, you get it for free, and some reason you kind of move up. So those are still there for those kind. We actually look at it as express of having some kind of business constraints in what we're doing in the free SKU. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So yes, remember I was talking about with Express and Compact. If you're using Express, we assume you want the consistency with the server and all of that, and it does run as a service. It does install in a central location, and the only way you can do that is admin rights. So either the end user needs to be an admin, or you need to SMS it out, whatever your deployment strategy is. If that's more of a problem, if deployment is a higher priority issue, then we have Compact, which you can privately deploy with your app, non-admin, a megabyte of DLLs, and just deploy it, and away you go. But you're making a trade, right? You got server, and then the client programming model, and there's good pros and cons of both there. I'll drill into Compact on Wednesday. Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, I'll be around for those of you who want to come and talk. I'll hope you enjoy the session. I appreciate it, and thanks for the feedback, and enjoy the rest of the week.